This analysis is part of a larger body of work in development, critiquing and fact-checking online propaganda. Lauren Southern's social media output employs a variety of propaganda techniques symptomatic of so-called alt-right agitators and publications, including factual misrepresentation, oversimplification, generalization, cherry-picking, strawman arguments, and willful tunnel vision and myopia. This is an analysis and critique of Lauren Southern's Why I Am Not a Feminist propaganda video.
I want to start by asking a question. If feminism is a movement for equality, why do we not see equal representation of both genders' issues? And why do we not see feminists complaining about benefits that women have over men in certain situations?
I bet very few people watching this video right now know that around 100,000 to 140,000 males are raped annually in U.S. prisons. This is more males raped than females in the U.S. annually. Yet feminists remain silent on the issue.
It's unclear what Southern is trying to say here. What does "this is more males raped than women in the US annually" mean? Is she comparing male and female inmates, or male inmates and American women in general? If she's comparing inmates by gender, the comparison is invalid as, according to the US Federal Bureau of Prisons, over 93% of inmates are male. And if she's comparing male inmates and American women in general, it's simply false. Firstly, let's look at her data. Southern cites Human Rights Watch as her source, but Human Rights Watch reference statistics from the US Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Statistics. Quoting the US Department of Justice's 2007 report on the National Inmate Survey, Human Rights Watch claims about 70,000 prisoners were sexually abused in US prisons in that year. This includes both genders. In the 2011 to 2012 report, approximately 23,000 male prisoners experienced inmate-on-inmate sexual victimization, both a far cry from the 100 to 140,000 range. But putting that to one side, the latest National Inmate Survey clearly shows that rates of sexual victimization of women inmates are far greater than men, 4 times greater in fact. If Southern is comparing male inmates and all women raped in US annually, the Bureau of Justice Statistics reveals that female rape and sexual assault victimization rates are far higher. On average, over 360,000 women are raped annually in the US. The undeniable reality is that women suffer significantly more sexual abuse, both in and out of prison.
Almost half the domestic abuse victims in the US and Canada are men. Yet there are no safe houses for them, no court advocacy programs, no subsidized counseling or legal care like women. Despite being half the victims, they are basically ignored.
There is a wealth of peer-reviewed academic literature on gender and domestic violence going back more than 30 years. Certainly there is dispute between academics about gender symmetry or asymmetry in intimate partner violence. However, reviews of the literature conclude that there is significant common ground among researchers. First, the official statistics from the US Department of Justice reveal that women suffer far greater rates of domestic abuse, at almost 5 times the rate of men. Even those academics who argue for gender symmetry in domestic violence and question the validity of using criminal statistics concede that the data is skewed dramatically toward male perpetrators because men inflict about 2/3 of the injuries in intimate partner violence, significant enough to warrant a criminal investigation. Formal academic reviews of the literature conclude that although women and men are equally likely to initiate physical violence in relationships involving less serious, what they term situational couple violence, such as pushing and shoving, relationships in which serious and very violent, what they term intimate terrorism occurs, men are much more likely to be perpetrators and women victims. Studies consistently indicate greater rates of injury among women and conclude that women tend to suffer more ill effects than men in such relationships. In response to the notion that men would be too ashamed or humiliated to call the police or go to the hospital if they were beaten by their wives, available empirical evidence suggests a very different picture. Men who are assaulted by intimates are actually more likely to call the police, more likely to press charges, and less likely to drop them. The undeniable reality is that women suffer more significantly from serious domestic violence. As for support services for victims of domestic violence, funding is predominantly provided through the US Department of Justice Crime Victims Fund. Approximately $200 to $300 million of funding are provided for victim compensation and assistance, including medical costs, counseling, crisis intervention, emergency shelters, lost wages or loss of support, criminal justice advocacy, emergency transportation, and so on. All victims of crime, irrespective of gender, are entitled to this support. Safe houses and legal assistance are also provided to men. The number of safe houses with female-centric names is not so much an indication that they cannot or will not accommodate men, but can simply be attributed to demand, as most persons fleeing serious, control-driven domestic abuse have been historically overwhelmingly women.
Men make up 80% of suicide victims, 92% of workplace deaths, 97% of combat deaths, and 77% of homicide victims.
I haven't got the patience to break down each of these separately, so I'll just take the most egregious misrepresentation here. It was only in January of 2013 that US Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta issued an order to end the US military policy of not allowing women in direct combat. So the fact that more men die in combat is simply a result of the historical exclusion of women in combat, and this makes it a rather ironic factoid.
As a woman, I will almost always win custody of children in a divorce case.
Gender bias in custody cases has also been a subject of serious academic research. The literature suggests that gender stereotypes that favour mothers' preferential claims to custody are not supported by research. Custody is granted to more women because, according to Pew Research, statistically married mothers spend far more time taking care of their children. Divorced or unwed fathers, on the whole, spend little time with their children. 56% of fathers either never see their children or only see their kids once a week. Also, the majority of child custody cases are not decided by the courts at all. They are determined voluntarily between the couple before or during mediation, and statistically, very few fathers seek custody during the divorce proceedings anyway.
I will receive less than half the sentence a man does for the exact same crime.
To quote one study, while the bulk of the accumulated evidence points to a continued disparity in sentencing outcomes for men and women, particularly in the decision to incarcerate, this disparity may well be warranted and not indicative of any pervasive bias. A greater proportion of women come before the courts with biographies that contain legitimate mitigating circumstances. For example, statistically, women convicted of a crime have fewer serious prior convictions, often have greater family responsibility and/or may be pregnant, often present as more repentant, have on the whole suffered greater childhood abuse, trauma, and family violence, all of which are legitimate and proper considerations in determining a sentence.
As a woman, I am more likely to get a government or military job, despite qualifications, just to fill a quota due to affirmative action. And I am also more likely to get into a university because of my gender.
It's not in the scope of this rebuttal to explain and illustrate the necessity of affirmative action, but briefly on the university admissions. Across the OECD, female high school students earn higher grades than their male peers, and young men are significantly more likely than young women to be less engaged with school and have low skills and poor academic achievement. They are also more likely to leave school early, often with no qualifications. Boys in the OECD countries, for example, are 8 percentage points more likely than girls to report that school is a waste of time. Since university admission is determined by high school academic achievement, I suggest this might explain the greater rate of female admission into universities.
So, if feminism really were a movement for equality, you would see feminists rioting about the 140,000 men raped. You would see them questioning the fact that women get less than half the prison sentence a man does for the exact same crime. Yet, we do not see equal representation of men's and women's issues.
But all of these errors and misrepresentations pale in comparison to the fact that Southern's argument is pure hypocrisy. Southern asserts that feminism is invalid because it does not take into account men's welfare. But when analysing Southern's online output of polemic and propaganda, she certainly does not create content along this paradigm. When defending European nationalism and Western cultural identity, why doesn't Southern follow her own standards and counterbalance her arguments by maybe chronicling, let's say, the disastrous Anglo-American interventions in the Middle East that accelerated the refugee crisis in the first place? When she espouses white male advocacy, why doesn't she counterbalance it with advocacy for women's rights, such as the right to be free from sexual harassment in the workplace and so on? She doesn't, not necessarily because she doesn't care about Iraqi orphans or female victims of harassment, but because it's not the subject of her argument, and not within the constraints of the cause that she is championing. In fact, there is no contradiction between fighting to end sexual harassment and fighting to improve men's mental health. One can be a feminist and care deeply for male rape victims in prisons. The two ideas are not mutually exclusive, they are just different causes. To nullify feminism, one needs to make the case that there is no remaining significant unfavourable structural bias against women. It's easy to cherry-pick examples where women are beneficiaries of bias or examples where men experience greater harm, but it's a different matter to dismiss the fact that women are seriously economically disadvantaged for having a uterus and bearing the responsibility of ensuring the continuation of the species, which is kind of a big deal. The expectation for feminist perspectives to counterbalance their point of view with the struggles of men calls for a kind of homogenization of all causes. One shouldn't just defend Western values, one should just defend goodness. So, okay. One shouldn't defend the political right against cultural Marxism, one should just defend freedom. Fine. But Southern certainly makes no effort at all to actually put this into practice with her own online advocacy. But now that I think about it, there is a term for conflating all of these causes into one catchy phrase. I think it's termed social justice. A little ironic, since apparently, to the armchair experts of the political right, social justice is just a dirty word.